"Stop! I'll buy that fat girl!" the Amish man shouted, and then he did the unthinkable. The dusty town square went silent. A father was about to trade his own daughter for a bottle of whiskey when a stranger in plain black clothes stepped forward. He didn't just buy her, he claimed her as his wife, right there before the jeering crowd. At first it seemed like salvation, but whispers spread. Why would a quiet man take in the girl everyone mocked? And what dark secret was she carrying from her father's past? A secret that could bring ruin not just on their home, but on an entire valley's water and land. As cattle barons draw near, rifles loaded and greed in their eyes, the new bride must face the shame she's carried all her life. The Amish man must choose, hide behind tradition, or stand against power, side by side with the woman no one else wanted. What will happen when a broken girl and a grieving widower defy the whole frontier? And will their fragile bond be enough to turn disgrace into redemption? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter Colorado winter wind whipped through the town square, cutting through coats and shawls like icy daggers. Frost crystals glinted on bare tree branches as the morning sun struggled to warm the gathering crowd. The scene unfolding before them was as cold as the weather itself. Jonas, his face flushed red from drink even at this early hour, yanked his daughter Kira onto a wooden crate. His fingers dug into her arm as she stumbled, trying to keep her balance. The rough wood boards creaked beneath her feet. "Who'll give me good whiskey for this one?" Jonas bellowed, his words slurring. "Strong back, wide hips, she'll work hard for whoever takes her." Kira's cheeks burned with shame as she stood there, her worn dress hanging loose on her frame. She kept her eyes fixed on the frozen ground, unable to meet the cruel stares of the townspeople. The crowd pressed closer, their jeers cutting deeper than the winter chill. "Too fat to be worth feeding," someone called out. "Ain't nobody wants Jonas's girl, she's as worthless as he is." Another voice added with a harsh laugh. The auctioneer, a thin man with greedy eyes, held up a bottle of rye whiskey. The amber liquid caught the weak sunlight as he waved it. "Opening bid right here. Who'll take her?" Kira's shoulders trembled, whether from cold or humiliation, it was hard to tell. Tears froze on her cheeks as she stood there, exposed to everyone's mockery. Her father swayed beside her, already reaching for the whiskey bottle with shaking hands. Then a strong, clear voice cut through the taunts. "Stop!" The crowd parted as Noel Stoltzfus stepped forward. His tall frame was wrapped in a plain black coat, his broad-brimmed hat shadowing serious eyes. The Amish widower's presence commanded attention, and the jeering voices fell silent. "I'll buy that fat girl," he declared, his voice carrying across the square. A shocked hush fell over the crowd. Even the winter wind seemed to hold its breath. Noel's boots crunched on the frozen ground as he approached the crate where Kira stood. Without haggling or ceremony, he reached into his coat and pulled out several silver coins, placing them deliberately on the corner of the crate. "But I'm not buying her for labor," he continued, his steady gaze meeting Kira's startled eyes. "I mean to marry her, here and now, before God and these witnesses." Gasps rippled through the gathered townsfolk. Women whispered behind mittened hands, while men shuffled their feet, suddenly uncomfortable with their earlier cruelty. Jonas's face twisted in rage and embarrassment. "You can't!" Jonas started to protest, but Noel cut him off. "The money's fair," Noel said firmly. "More than fair for the whiskey you were asking. The choice now belongs to the lady." Jonas cursed, his words trailing off into mumbles as he snatched up the silver coins. He staggered away from the crate, leaving his daughter standing alone before the tall stranger who had just offered to save her with marriage. Noel turned to Kira, his expression softening as he held out his hand to her. The gesture was gentle, offering dignity where there had been only shame moments before. Kira stared at his extended hand, her mind whirling with confusion and desperate hope. The crowd waited in tense silence. Would she accept this unexpected salvation? Kira's hand trembled as she slowly lifted it, hesitating for just a moment before placing it in Noel's strong, calloused palm. His fingers closed carefully around hers, warm despite the cold morning air. For the first time that morning, Kira raised her eyes to fully meet Noel's gaze. In his steady look, she found no mockery, no cruelty, only quiet compassion and something that might, in time, grow into real kindness. The same townsfolk who had jeered at her minutes before now stood silent, bearing witness to this strange and solemn moment. Whatever tomorrow might bring, today Kira had found an unexpected harbor from the storm of her father's cruelty, and Noel Stoltzfus had done the unthinkable, chosen the one everyone else had rejected. Their hands remained joined as they stood together in the winter morning, an unlikely pair united by one man's determination to right a wrong and one woman's courage to grasp at hope when it was offered. Dawn broke cold and grey over the little town chapel. Oil lamps flickered against frost-covered window panes, casting weak yellow light across rough-hewn pews. The wooden floors creaked beneath Kira's feet as she stood before the altar, her worn calico dress a stark contrast to the usual wedding finery such occasions demanded. Whispers echoed through the chapel as townsfolk filed in, their breath visible in the chilly air. They hadn't come to celebrate, they'd come to stare. Kira felt their eyes boring into her back, heard their hushed commentary about the strange marriage of Jonas's unwanted daughter to the quiet Amish widower. The preacher stood before them, his expression caught between duty and doubt. His Bible lay open in his weathered hands, pages rustling as he searched for the proper verses. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty, "to join these two in holy matrimony." Kira kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her cheeks burning with shame. Her father hadn't even bothered to appear. The same people who had jeered at her in the town square yesterday now sat in judgment of her hasty wedding. But then Noel's steady voice filled the chapel, clear and sure as he spoke his vows. "I, Noel Stoltzfus, take thee, Kira, to be my wedded wife." His words carried weight and dignity, transforming the hurried ceremony into something more meaningful. "I promise before God and these witnesses to be faithful and true, to provide and protect, to honor and cherish, until death parts us." When it came time for Kira's response, her voice trembled. The words felt foreign on her tongue as she mumbled them, barely audible in the hushed chapel. Yet Noel's presence beside her remained calm and reassuring, his quiet strength lending her courage to continue. The preacher pronounced them man and wife with little ceremony, closing his Bible with a dull thump that echoed in the silent chapel. No music played, no celebrations followed. Noel simply offered Kira his arm and led her outside into the biting morning air. A wagon waited before the chapel steps, hitched to a sturdy draft horse whose breath steamed in the cold. Noel helped Kira up onto the wooden seat, tucking a heavy wool blanket around her before taking up the reins. The horse's hooves clopped against frozen ground as they left the town behind, the wagon wheels finding every icy rut in the trail. They rode in silence for a while, the landscape opening up before them, endless white fields under a pearl-grey sky. Kira clutched her thin shawl tighter, watching her new husband's profile as he guided the horse along the snowy track. Finally, Noel spoke, his voice soft but clear above the creak of wagon wheels. "I reckon you might want to know why I stepped forward yesterday." He paused, gathering his thoughts. 3 years passed. I lost my wife Rebecca and our 2 little ones in a fire. The barn caught in the night. Nothing to be done. Kira turned to study his face, seeing grief etched in the lines around his eyes, though his expression remained composed. He continued, "When I saw you standing there yesterday, I felt the Lord's hand upon my shoulder. No person should suffer such humiliation, least of all a daughter of God." The wagon rocked steadily onward as Noel explained his simple faith, his belief in divine providence that had led him to intervene. Kira listened, her mind whirling with uncertainty. She had escaped her father's cruelty, yes, but what awaited her in this new life? This strange, quiet man beside her remained a mystery. The short winter day was already fading when they crested a small rise. Below them stretched Noel's farm, neat fenced fields now blanketed in snow, a barn with smoke curling from its chimney, and a modest 2-story farmhouse standing alone against the gathering dusk. A single lamp burned in the kitchen window, its golden light reaching out across the pristine white landscape. The horse's pace slowed as they approached, its hooves breaking through crusty snow. Kira sat motionless, taking in what was to be her new home. The farmhouse looked solid and well-maintained, so different from the tumble-down shack where she'd grown up. Yet as the wagon drew closer, she couldn't help wondering if she had truly found sanctuary, or simply traded one prison for another. They came to a stop before the house, its weather-worn boards glowing amber in the last light of day. The lamp in the window cast long shadows across the snow, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called out to the rising moon. The kitchen's warmth wrapped around them as Noel lit the oil lamp on the simple wooden table. Its flame cast dancing shadows across the walls, fighting back the darkness that pressed against the windows. Steam rose from a pot of beans, and the earthy smell of boiled potatoes filled the room. A loaf of dark bread, clearly home-baked, sat beside plain tin plates. Kira perched uncertainly on the edge of her chair, hands folded in her lap. The quiet felt heavy between them, broken only by the crack and pop of the cooking fire. Noel settled into his seat and bowed his head, his voice steady in prayer. "Lord, we thank thee for this food and for new beginnings. Guide us in thy wisdom and show us thy path. Amen." The word beginnings hung in the air as he raised his head. Noel served the simple meal with careful movements, setting portions of beans and potatoes on each plate before breaking the bread. Kira picked at her food, taking tiny bites, her shoulders tense beneath her worn dress. The clink of utensils against tin echoed in the silence. Noel ate steadily, his manner unhurried. He seemed content to let the quiet stretch, but Kira felt words building inside her chest like storm clouds. Finally they spilled out. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The fork in her hand trembled slightly. "About my father." Noel set down his spoon, giving her his full attention. The lamplight caught the silver threading through his dark beard as he nodded for her to continue. "The spring that runs through his land." Kira's throat tightened around the words. "He didn't come by it honest. The Apache people, they had grazing rights there. Had papers to prove it and everything." She stared down at her barely touched plate. "Father got them drunk, made them sign new papers, took it all away." Noel's brow furrowed, creating deep lines across his forehead. His eyes, usually gentle, grew troubled as he listened. "I saw him do it," Kira continued, the words tumbling out faster now. "Watched him pour whiskey and laugh while they signed. Sarah, she's their matriarch, she cursed him afterward, said the water would turn bitter in his hands." Her fingers twisted in her skirt. "I'm afraid that curse might follow me, might poison what you've built here." "Kira," Noel's voice was soft but firm. "Look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly to meet his steady gaze. "The Lord does not visit the sins of the father upon the child," he said. "You bear no guilt for another's wrongdoing." Though his words carried conviction, Kira noticed the worry that flickered in his eyes. He understood, as she did, that such deeds rarely stayed buried. The land held memories, and water rights meant life itself in these parts. The fire had burned low, casting red gleams across the kitchen floor, when 3 sharp knocks rattled the front door. Noel rose, his chair scraping against the wooden boards. Kira's heart jumped at the sudden sound. Wind and snow swirled in as Noel opened the door to reveal Tom Wheeler, a neighboring farmer. His face was red from cold and exertion, his breath coming in quick puffs of steam. "Evening, Noel," Wheeler said, stamping snow from his boots. "Hate to disturb you so late, but there's news you need to hear." His eyes flicked to Kira, then back to Noel. "It's about Harlan Grieve." Kira's hands clenched in her lap at the cattle baron's name. Everyone knew Grieve, his vast herds, his armed riders, his hunger for more land, more water, more power. "He's making moves on that spring up by Jonas's place," Wheeler continued. "Word is he's not planning to ask nice about it either. His men were in town today, buying up ammunition." He shook his head grimly. "Thought you ought to know, being as you're—" He gestured vaguely toward Kira. "Thank you for the warning," Noel said quietly. "God be with you on your ride home." After Wheeler left, silence fell heavy as a wool blanket. Kira stared into the dying fire, watching the flames curl and fade to ember. Her voice, when it came, was hollow with despair. "I've brought ruin to your door," she whispered. "My father's sins have followed me here after all." The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney into the dark winter night. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pink and gold as Noel led his team from the barn. The horse's breath steamed in the cold morning air while he checked each buckle and strap with careful hands. Kira watched from the farmhouse door, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Noel paused in his work, studying her face. After a moment, he nodded. "The road will be rough." "I need to face what's coming," she replied. "I won't hide." The wagon creaked as they set out, iron-rimmed wheels crunching through frozen ruts. Fields stretched white and empty on either side, the morning sun casting long shadows across untouched snow. Neither spoke much as they rode, each lost in thought about the day ahead. Town was already bustling when they arrived. Outside the saloon, 3 of Grieve's riders lounged against their saddles, rifles prominent on their hips. Their eyes followed the wagon as it passed, and Kira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Water rights are water rights," one man's voice carried across the street. "Grieve aims to settle it his way if papers don't satisfy." At the general store, Kira kept close to Noel as they gathered supplies. The whispers started almost immediately, following them between the shelves like shadows. "That's her, the bought wife. Sold for whiskey money, I heard. Wonder what the plain folk make of such a match." Each word cut like a knife, but Kira forced herself to stand straight. Noel's presence beside her was steady as a wall, his broad shoulders somehow shielding her from the worst of the stares. He paid for their goods with quiet dignity, adding extra flour and sugar to their usual order. The telegraph office was their next stop. While Noel drafted his message to the county clerk, Kira stood by the window, watching people hurry past on their morning errands. The operator's fingers clicked out the inquiry about water rights and land claims, but he warned it could be weeks before papers arrived by post with any answers. "Mail coach runs slow in winter," he explained, counting out Noel's coins, especially with snow in the passes. As they drove toward Apache territory, the sun climbed higher, but its light seemed to carry little warmth. The landscape changed gradually, more rocks, fewer fences, until they reached the boundary of tribal lands. Kira's heart pounded as she spotted smoke rising from several lodges. "Stop here," she said suddenly, touching Noel's arm. "Please." He drew the team to a halt, turning to study her face. "Are you certain?" Kira nodded, clutching the fresh bread they had bought in town. "I have to try." They approached on foot, Noel walking slightly behind her, his hat respectfully in his hands. Several women paused in their work to watch their approach, their faces carefully neutral. Children disappeared into lodges at their parents' quiet words. Sarah, the Apache matriarch, sat before her lodge, her dark eyes sharp as she evaluated the visitors. Her son Henry stood nearby, one hand resting casually on his rifle. The silence stretched tight as a bowstring. Kira's legs shook as she knelt in the dirt before Sarah, offering the bread with both hands. "I come to apologize," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "for my father's betrayal. For the spring he stole through deceit." Sarah's weathered face revealed nothing, but her eyes never left Kira's. "I know words cannot restore what was taken," Kira continued, tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "But I carry the shame of his actions. I ask forgiveness, though I deserve none." Behind her, Noel remained silent, but his presence lent her strength. The bread in her hands felt heavy as stone as she waited. Finally, Henry stepped forward. His movements were deliberate as he accepted the bread from Kira's hands. He broke it, offering a piece first to his mother, then taking a portion himself. Only then did Sarah's expression soften slightly. "You are not your father," the older woman said at last. Her voice was rough as stone, but not unkind. "You choose a different path." The sun was sinking toward the western hills as Noel and Kira began their journey home. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them felt different now, thoughtful rather than fearful. Kira watched their shadows stretch long across the snow, sensing that something had shifted today. A tiny bridge had begun to form across a mighty gulf, but she could still feel old wounds and fresh hostility hanging in the cold air around them. The first hints of dawn had not yet touched the horizon when Kira slipped from beneath her quilt. The floorboards creaked softly under her feet as she made her way to the kitchen, determined to show her worth to her new household. She kindled the cooking fire with careful hands, watching the flames catch and grow in the iron stove. Soon, savory aromas filled the kitchen. Salt pork sizzled in the skillet, its rich scent mingling with fresh-baked biscuits browning in the oven. Kira worked quickly, cracking eggs into the hot grease with practiced ease. Her father may have been a drunkard, but she had learned to cook for the ranch hands years ago. When Noel entered the kitchen, he paused in surprise. The table was already set, steam rising from generous portions. Kira stood nervously by the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "You've been busy," he said softly, removing his broad-brimmed hat. "I hope it pleases you," she replied, her cheeks flushing. Noel bowed his head in prayer, then took a bite of the golden biscuit. His eyes widened slightly. "These are very good, Kira. You have a gift with bread." Before she could respond, voices carried from outside. Through the window, Kira spotted several women in plain dresses and white caps walking up the path. Her heart began to pound. Noel's Amish neighbors had come to inspect his sudden bride. The women filed into the kitchen, their curious gazes taking in every detail. Kira saw their eyes linger on her size, her worldly dress, her nervous hands. The eldest, a stern-faced widow named Martha, pressed her lips together in clear disapproval. "We've come to welcome the new wife," Martha announced, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Welcome indeed," Noel said firmly. He gestured to the fresh biscuits. "Kira has already proven herself a fine baker. Would you care to try one?" The women couldn't refuse such an offer without seeming rude. As they sampled the breakfast, their rigid postures softened slightly. Kira caught a few surprised glances between them at the food's quality. "You've learned to cook well," one younger widow admitted. "Thank you," Kira replied softly. "I hope to learn your ways too." After the neighbors departed, Noel took Kira outside to begin teaching her the daily routines. In the barn, his strong hands guided hers as she learned to milk the cows. The rhythm was strange at first, but she persisted until she found the proper motion. "Like this?" she asked, finally getting a steady stream of milk. "Yeah, exactly so." Noel nodded, approval warming his voice. They moved through other chores together. Noel showed her how to check harnesses for wear, explaining which parts needed mending. Kira's fingers were clumsy with the heavy leather at first, but she concentrated on each stitch. When they carried firewood from the pile to the house, she matched Noel load for load, though her arms trembled with the effort. As afternoon faded toward evening, the sound of children's laughter drifted across the yard. A group of young ones appeared, carrying carefully wrapped bundles. Kira recognized them as neighborhood children, come to deliver quilt squares to Noel. "Welcome, little ones," she called out, smiling warmly. "Would you like to see something funny?" The children gathered closer, curious despite their shyness. Kira began telling them about the time she had tried to catch a chicken and ended up falling into the pig pen instead. Her gestures were exaggerated, her timing awkward, but the children's giggles grew with each detail. And then, she waved her arms dramatically, "Splat! Right in the mud!" The children's laughter rang out bright and clear. Even the oldest boy, trying to seem grown up, couldn't help grinning. They stayed a while longer, shyness forgotten, as Kira told more stories about her mishaps on her father's ranch. From the barn doorway, Noel watched the scene unfold. He noticed how naturally Kira drew the children out, how her own face lit up at their joy. Something warm settled in his chest as he observed his new wife winning over the little ones with her gentle humor. Later that evening, Kira sat in the lamplight, carefully mending a tear in one of Noel's sleeves. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of her needle pulling thread through fabric. "Maybe," she whispered to herself, so quietly even she could barely hear. "Maybe I do have a place here after all." Her fingers traced the neat stitches she had made, and for the first time since her father had dragged her onto that auction block, hope bloomed quietly in her heart. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of crispness that made breath visible in the air. Kira smoothed her plain dress nervously as Noel helped her into the wagon. They were heading to the weekly Amish service, held this time in the Yoder family's barn. The wagon wheels crunched over frozen ruts as they joined other buggies on the dirt road. Kira watched families arrive, their dark clothing stark against the winter landscape. Her heart fluttered as they approached the barn, where lanterns already glowed in the early morning shadows. Inside, the barn had been transformed. Clean straw covered the floor, and simple benches lined both sides of a center aisle. Following custom, women moved to sit on one side, while men took their places on the other. Kira found herself among the black-clad wives and daughters, acutely aware of her larger frame among their spare figures. The service began with hymns sung in German, voices rising in austere harmony. Though Kira couldn't understand the words, the melody touched something deep within her. She closed her eyes, letting the pure notes wash over her. When she opened them again, she caught Noel watching her from across the aisle, a gentle smile touching his lips. As the final hymn faded, The congregation prepared to share the traditional meal together. Kira's hands trembled slightly as she retrieved the bread she had baked before dawn. She had spent extra care on this loaf, hoping to prove herself worthy of her new community. Martha, the stern widow who had visited earlier that week, approached the food table where Kira stood with her offering. The older woman's eyes narrowed as she inspected the golden brown crust. With deliberate movement, she broke off a piece and tasted it. "The bread is good," Martha pronounced, her voice carrying to nearby ears. Other women stepped forward to sample it, nodding in agreement. Kira felt warmth bloom in her chest as the platter was passed around, watching faces soften with appreciation. The journey home seemed lighter somehow. As their wagon rolled through the afternoon sunshine, Kira gathered her courage to speak what lay heavy on her heart. "I want so much to belong here," she said softly, her words barely audible above the creak of wheels. "But sometimes it feels impossible." Noel clicked gently to the horses before responding. "The Lord's strength is made perfect in weakness," he quoted, his voice steady and sure. 2 Corinthians tells us this. When we feel most unable, that is when His power works through us. Kira pondered his words as they completed their journey home. The sun was setting by the time they had finished the evening chores, casting long shadows across the barnyard. They had just settled by the fire when a sharp knock startled them both. Noel rose quickly, hand moving to the door latch. Outside stood Henry, the young Apache scout, his face grave in the lamplight. "May I enter?" he asked formally, showing respect for their home. "Please." Noel stepped back, gesturing welcome. Kira hurried to put coffee on the stove while the men settled near the hearth. Henry's news was troubling. "Greaves' riders have moved cattle near the spring," he reported, accepting the steaming cup Kira offered. "They push boundaries, testing how far they can go. Our people fear blood will flow if this continues." Noel's face grew serious as he listened. "How many cattle?" 20 head so far. More coming, we think. They build fences where they have no right." "We are grateful for your warning," Noel said, refilling Henry's cup. "It could not have been easy to ride here after dark." Henry nodded, understanding the unspoken question of trust. "My grandmother, she says you and your wife showed respect. We return respect with warning." They talked a while longer by the fire, sharing concerns about Greaves' growing aggression. When Henry finally rose to leave, both Noel and Kira walked him to the door. They watched his figure disappear into the darkness, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. Turning to each other, husband and wife shared a long look, understanding passing between them without words. The trouble they had hoped to avoid was coming, as surely as winter turns to spring. In the lamplight, their shadows stretched across the wooden floor, merged into one dark shape against the wall. Outside, a coyote called into the night, its lonely cry echoing across the silent prairie. The crisp morning air rang with the steady rhythm of hammers striking nails. Noel's farmyard buzzed with activity as dozens of Amish families gathered for the barn raising. Men in dark coats and broad-brimmed hats worked together, lifting heavy beams into place while women prepared food at long tables set beneath the autumn trees. Kira moved among them, her arms laden with steaming plates of cornbread and beans. Though some of the women still cast doubtful glances her way, she worked without pause, determined to prove her worth. She had risen before dawn to bake 6 apple pies, and the sweet scent now mingled with sawdust and fresh timber. "More nails!" called a voice from above. Kira hurried to fetch another box, her skirts swishing against the dry grass. As she handed them up, she caught sight of Noel on the rising framework. Sweat gleamed on his brow despite the cool air, and he worked with quiet efficiency, directing younger men with gentle authority. Children darted between the busy adults, their laughter brightening the autumn day. A small girl tugged at Kira's apron, holding up a broken doll. Without hesitation, Kira settled on a nearby stump, pulled thread from her pocket, and began mending the toy. Soon more children gathered around her, drawn by her warm smile and gentle hands. "Tell us a story," they begged, and Kira found herself describing her childhood adventures by the creek, making them giggle with tales of mud-splashed mishaps and friendly frogs. Their mothers, hearing the laughter, paused in their work to listen, their faces softening. The afternoon sun was lowering when unexpected visitors arrived. Henry appeared at the edge of the gathering, accompanied by his mother, Sarah, the Apache matriarch. They carried a wrapped bundle that proved to be fresh venison offered with dignified ceremony. "We bring food to share," Sarah announced, her voice clear and strong, "as neighbors should." A hush fell over the gathering. Kira stepped forward, accepting the gift with both hands and a deep nod of respect. "We are honored," she said, meaning every word. "Please join our meal." The tension eased as Sarah moved to help the women prepare the meat, sharing quiet words about herbs and cooking methods. Henry joined the men working on the barn's frame, his skilled hands quickly finding rhythm with the others. As dusk approached, lanterns were lit inside the nearly finished barn. Their golden glow spilled out through the fresh-cut boards, casting long shadows across the yard. Someone started a hymn, and voices rose in harmony, German words from the Amish, joined by Apache melodies in their own tongue, creating an unexpected but beautiful chorus. A little girl grabbed Kira's hands, pulling her into a spinning dance. For a moment, Kira hesitated, conscious of her size and the eyes upon her. But the child's joy was infectious, and soon they were twirling together, their skirts swishing in time with the music. Kira's laughter rang out, free and genuine for the first time since her wedding day. Noel paused in his work to watch his wife dance, something warm kindling in his eyes. He saw not the fat girl the townsfolk had mocked, but a woman whose gentle spirit drew children and bridged ancient divisions. His hands stilled on the wooden beam as he observed her happiness. The music swelled, filling the new barn with hope. Amish women shared bread with Apache elders, while children played together without concern for the differences in their dress or speech. For one shining moment, the barriers between communities seemed to fade in the lantern light. Then came the thunder of hoofbeats. A rider burst into the yard, his horse lathered with sweat. "Grieve!" he shouted, pulling hard on the reins. "Grieve's coming with armed men. They mean to take the spring." The music died instantly. Children were quickly gathered by worried mothers. The Apache visitors exchanged dark looks, while the Amish men set down their tools with deliberate calm. In the sudden silence, all eyes turned to Noel. He stood straight and tall in the lantern light, his jaw tight with determination. The peace of the evening had shattered like glass, but there was no fear in his stance, only resolute purpose. Sarah, the Apache matriarch, moved to stand beside him, her face grave in the growing darkness. Henry's hand went to the knife at his belt. The Amish men formed a quiet circle, their presence solid as the new barn's beams. Kira felt the little girl's hand slip from hers as the child was hurried away. The joy of moments before faded like morning mist, replaced by the heavy knowledge that violence approached their peaceful gathering. She watched her husband's face, seeing in his expression that the time for singing was over. The pale winter sun had barely crested the eastern hills when Noel hitched the horses to his wagon. Frost sparkled on bare branches, and their breath clouded in the bitter morning air. Kira pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she climbed up beside her husband, while Henry rode alongside on his pinto pony, alert for trouble. The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ground as they made their way toward the disputed spring. Kira's stomach churned with each bump and jolt. This was the water her father had stolen through false papers and empty promises, and now his sin had drawn the cattle baron's greed. They heard the men before they saw them. Harsh laughter and the sharp ring of hammers carried through the crisp air. As they crested a small rise, Kira's heart sank. 5 of Greaves' riders had already started work, driving posts into the frozen earth around the spring. Rifle barrels glinted in the early light, strapped to their saddles within easy reach. The men paused in their labor as Noel's wagon approached, their faces hard with challenge. Henry stayed back, watching from the tree line with the stillness of a hunter. His presence was both reassurance and warning. The Apache would not stand idle while their water was stolen twice over. Noel drew the wagon to a halt and stepped down, his movements deliberate and calm. "Friends," he called out, though his tone held steel beneath its courtesy, "I must ask you to cease this work. The ownership of this spring is in dispute, and no fencing should be done until legal proof is shown." The biggest of the riders spat on the ground. "Greaves says different. He's got papers saying this water's his now." "Then let him present those papers properly," Noel replied. "Until then, this land must remain open." "Well, if it ain't the plain folk and his bought bride," another rider sneered, looking past Noel to where Kira sat in the wagon. "Heard you got her cheap. Just a few coins for that fat girl. Reckon you overpaid even then." Cruel laughter rippled through the group. Kira felt the old shame flood back, hot and suffocating. The memory of that terrible morning in the town square, her father's drunken voice, the jeering crowd, her own helpless humiliation, crashed over her like icy water. Noel stepped sideways, placing himself squarely between Kira and their mockery. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but carried like thunder. "You will not speak of my wife with disrespect." The men's hands drifted toward their rifles, but Henry chose that moment to emerge from the trees, his presence a silent reminder that more eyes watched than they knew. After a tense moment, the leader shrugged. "Get on back to your praying, plain folk. This spring belongs to Greave now, and that's all there is to it." The ride home passed in heavy silence. Kira kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded tightly in her lap. Even Henry's farewell nod as he turned toward his own people's lands barely registered through her shame. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the kitchen floor, Kira moved through the motions of preparing supper. Her hands shook as she set bread and stew before Noel. When he bowed his head to pray, she couldn't hold back the tears any longer. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You deserve so much better than a wife who brings such trouble. Someone slim and pretty, respected in town. Not someone bought for pennies who only brings shame and danger to your door." Noel reached across the table and took her trembling hands in his. His calloused fingers were gentle, his grip warm and steady. "Kira," he said softly, "you are God's answer to my prayers." She tried to pull away, but he held firm. "After I lost Rachel and the children," he continued, "I thought my heart would never heal. But God sent me you, not just someone to share my work, but a woman of courage and kindness. Your size matters nothing. Your spirit is what I see, what God sees." The simple truth in his words pierced her defenses. Still, when Noel retired to bed later, Kira remained by the hearth, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. His love offered such hope, such acceptance, everything she had never thought to find. Yet the mocking voices echoed in her memory, feeding doubts that gnawed at her peace. She stared deep into the fire, one hand pressed to her chest where joy and shame warred like summer storm and winter frost. The flames blurred through her tears as she sat alone, caught between the wonderful future Noel offered and the weight of unworthiness that clung to her like chains. Heavy snow swept across the valley, transforming Noel's farmstead into a world of white silence. Wind howled around the corners of the house, but inside, warmth and quiet industry held sway. The forced confinement brought an unexpected gift: time together without the watching eyes of others. Kira sat in the cushioned rocker by the hearth, her fingers steady as she mended one of Noel's work shirts. Across from her, Noel worked at cleaning his tools, the rhythmic scraping a comfortable counterpoint to the storm's fury outside. A pot of bean soup simmered on the stove, filling the air with savory warmth. The children loved days like this, Noel said softly, breaking their companionable silence, his hands stilled on the saw he was oiling. Rachel would gather them close and tell stories while they helped her card wool. Kira's fingers paused in their work. This was the first time he had spoken of his lost family so directly. She held her breath, not wanting to break the delicate moment. Daniel was just 7. Noel continued, his voice steady though his eyes glistened. Sarah had turned 5 that spring. Both of them had Rachel's gentle spirit. He drew a deep breath. The fire took them while I was helping at a neighbor's barn raising. By the time I saw the smoke, Kira set aside her mending and crossed to him, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. Tell me about them, she whispered. I would like to know the family that came before me. Over the next days, as the storm raged outside, Noel shared his memories in quiet moments between their work. He spoke of Rachel's skill with herbs, how she could coax any plant to grow. Of Daniel's laugh when chasing fireflies, of Sarah's determination to learn her letters. His voice would sometimes catch, but he pressed on, as if sharing these stories was a gift he had long waited to give. They fell into a peaceful rhythm, cooking, cleaning, reading scripture together in the evenings. Kira discovered Noel's quiet humor, his thoughtful way of considering every question she asked about the Bible passages. He showed her how to properly clean and oil the leather harnesses, while she taught him her mother's method for making perfect biscuits. But their peaceful interlude ended when the storm finally broke. The sun emerged on a crystalline morning, the fresh snow blinding white against the blue sky. They had just finished the breakfast dishes when heavy knocking rattled the door. Noel opened it to find Preacher Matthews on the step, flanked by several prominent townsmen. Their faces were grim as stone. "Brother Stoltzfus," the preacher said, not waiting for an invitation to step inside. "We've come to speak about this situation you've created." The other men filed in, stamping snow from their boots. Their eyes fell on Kira with barely concealed disdain. She shrank back toward the kitchen, but Noel moved to stand beside her. "What situation would that be?" Noel asked quietly. "This marriage of yours," Matthews said, gesturing toward Kira. "And your dealings with the Apache. There's talk of violence brewing. Greaves' men are riled, and some say you're encouraging the Indians to resist." One of the other men, a store owner named Porter, spoke up. "You've brought trouble to peaceful folk by taking up with—" He glanced at Kira, his lip curling. "This woman. Her father's schemes with that spring have set neighbor against neighbor. And now you consort with savages," another added. "Having them at your barn raising, treating with them like equals. It ain't natural." Kira felt the familiar shame burning in her chest, but Noel's steady presence beside her gave her strength. His voice, when he spoke, was firm and clear. "My wife bears no guilt for her father's actions," he said, "and the Apache are our neighbors, created in God's image just as we are. I will not abandon either my wife or my conscience to ease your minds." The preacher's face darkened. "You risk bringing destruction on all of us with this stubborn pride. The girl's not worth—" "Enough." Noel's word cut through the air like a blade. "My wife has a name. She is Kira Stoltzfus, and she is worthy of all respect. I will hear no more slander against her or our Apache neighbors. If you cannot speak with Christian charity, I must ask you to leave." A heavy silence fell. The visitors exchanged glances, then began moving towards the door, muttering among themselves. The preacher was the last to leave. "You'll regret this obstinance, Brother Stoltzfus," he said from the doorway. "Mark my words, trouble's coming, and you've chosen the wrong side." The door closed with a final thud, leaving Noel and Kira standing together in their suddenly quiet home. Through the window, they could see the men trudging through the snow toward their waiting horses, their angry voices carrying faintly on the crisp air. Morning sunlight streamed through frosted window panes as Kira kneaded dough for the day's bread. Her fingers worked rhythmically, finding peace in the familiar task. The quiet was broken by heavy pounding at the door that made her jump. Noel opened it to reveal Jonas, Kira's father, swaying slightly on the step. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes bloodshot but alert with cruel purpose. The sour smell of whiskey clung to him, though he seemed steadier than his usual drunken state. "Come to see my girl," he slurred, shouldering past Noel into the warm kitchen. His gaze fell on Kira, who had frozen at her work, flour dusting her trembling hands. "Father," she whispered, "why are you here?" Jonas's lip curled in a sneer. "Heard tell my daughter's playing at being a proper wife." He raised his voice, clearly meant to carry beyond the walls. "Though ain't much proper about being bought like cattle, is there? That's what you are, just merchandise, sold to the highest bidder." Outside, the clip-clop of passing horses slowed. Voices murmured, catching the cruel words floating through the open door. "You need to leave," Noel said firmly, stepping between them. But Jonas wasn't finished. His voice grew louder, taunting. "Grieve told me all about your plans for that spring. Says he's coming to claim it within days, and ain't nothing you can do to stop him. Your precious Apache friends better watch their backs." Kira's hands fell limply to her sides, leaving white fingerprints in the dough. She could hear the riders outside spurring their horses on, no doubt eager to spread fresh gossip through town. All her careful work to build respect, to prove herself worthy, destroyed in moments by her father's venom. "Get out," Noel commanded, taking Jonas's arm. "You will not speak to my wife this way." Jonas yanked free, stumbling towards the door. "Your wife?" He laughed harshly. "She ain't fit to be nobody's wife. Ask anyone in town, they'll tell you what she is." The door slammed behind him, but the damage was done. Kira sank to her knees, tears flowing freely now. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, Noel. You should release me from this marriage. Find someone worthy of you, someone without my shame." Noel crossed to her, gathering her in his strong arms, but she pulled away. "No," she choked out. "Don't you see? I've brought nothing but trouble. The town scorns you because of me. Grieve threatens violence because of my father's schemes. You deserve peace, not this constant battle." "Kira," Noel began, reaching for her again, but she backed away. "Please," she whispered, "just leave me be for now." The day passed in a heavy silence. Kira went through her chores mechanically, her mind churning with shame and despair. As evening fell, she watched Noel's face in the lamplight as he read his Bible, seeing the worry lines creasing his gentle features. Her heart ached, knowing she had brought those lines there. That night, she lay awake long after Noel's breathing had settled into the rhythm of sleep. The moon cast silver light through their window, illuminating the simple furniture, the clean, swept floors, the orderly life she had disrupted with her presence. Near midnight, she rose silently. With trembling hands, she packed a small bundle, a change of clothes, a bit of bread, her mother's worn prayer book. Tears fell as she penned a brief note. "You deserve better. Thank you for your kindness. K." She waited until the false dawn, when the world was still wrapped in darkness, but the eastern sky held a promise of light. The door barely creaked as she slipped out into the bitter cold. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she turned toward the distant Apache lodge where she had once sought forgiveness. Behind her, the farmhouse stood silent, holding the sleeping man who had offered her dignity, respect, and the beginning of love. But love, she told herself, sometimes meant leaving before you could bring more harm to those you cared for. The sun rose fully as Noel stirred in their bed. His hand reached automatically for Kira's warmth beside him, finding only cold sheets. His eyes snapped open, heart beginning to pound as he took in the empty room, the missing bundle, the folded paper on her pillow. "Kira?" he called, his voice echoing through the quiet house. But only silence answered as dawn painted the fresh snow gold, erasing her tracks with its brilliant light. Dawn painted the eastern sky in bands of pink and gold as Noel rushed to saddle his horse. His fingers trembled as he cinched the leather straps, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The gelding stamped nervously, sensing his master's urgency. "Lord, guide my path," Noel prayed aloud, swinging into the saddle. "Lead me to her." Snow stung his face as he urged his mount forward. The wind had picked up, driving icy needles through his plain black coat. He scanned the ground desperately, looking for any sign of Kira's passage. Near the edge of his property, relief flooded through him as he spotted tracks in the fresh snow. Small boot prints heading toward Apache land. The prints told a story that made his heart ache. They started out steady and determined, but grew erratic as they continued. Here and there he saw where Kira had stumbled, leaving deeper impressions in the snow. The stride between steps shortened, suggesting exhaustion. "Hold on, Kira," he whispered, urging his horse faster. The tracks led him into the hills, winding between snow-laden pines. The wind grew fiercer, whipping his broad-brimmed hat. Still he pressed on, following those faltering footprints until they disappeared altogether in a fresh drift of snow. "Kira!" he called out, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. Then he saw it, a dark shape huddled near a grove of pines. His heart lurched as he recognized Kira's dress, half buried in white. She lay curled on her side, shivering violently, her lips tinged blue. Noel leaped from his horse, dropping to his knees beside her. "Kira, can you hear me?" Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her. Gathering her gently in his arms, he was shocked at how cold she felt. "I've got you," he murmured, lifting her carefully. "I've got you now." The Apache lodge wasn't far. He could see smoke rising from its chimney through the trees. Holding Kira close to his chest, he led his horse on foot, speaking quiet prayers of thanks for finding her in time. As they approached the lodge, Henry emerged, his expression grave. The young Apache scout quickly took in the situation and called out in his native tongue. Within moments, Sarah, the Apache matriarch, appeared in the doorway. Her stern face softened slightly at the sight of Kira's condition. She gestured for Noel to bring her inside, where a fire burned warm and bright. She ran away, Noel explained as he gently laid Kira near the hearth. She believes she brings only trouble to those around her. Sarah knelt beside Kira, checking her breathing. Other members of the lodge gathered, watching silently as the matriarch began removing Kira's wet clothes and wrapping her in warm blankets. Noel stood straight, addressing them all. "I know what people say about her, that she was bought, that she brings shame." His voice grew stronger, ringing with conviction. "But they are wrong. Kira is not my burden. She is my partner, my gift from God. He brought her to me when I thought my heart would never heal." Henry translated his words, and Noel saw understanding dawn in Sarah's eyes. The matriarch nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his declaration. She sought your forgiveness. Noel continued, because she carries guilt for her father's wrongs. But her heart is pure. She sees beyond the barriers others build. She is exactly who I need, who we all need, in these troubled times. A soft sound drew their attention. Kira stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Noel!" she whispered, tears beginning to trail down her cheeks. He knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. "I'm here." "Why did you come after me?" "Because you are my wife," he said simply. "Where you go, I go. Your struggles are my struggles. Your joy is my joy." Fresh tears spilled from Kira's eyes as she gripped his hand tighter. Sarah placed a warm cup of herbal tea in her other hand, nodding with approval at the love she witnessed between them. Outside, the wind continued to howl, driving snow against the lodge's walls. But inside, wrapped in warmth and surrounded by unexpected allies, Kira finally began to believe that she had found not just shelter, but home. Morning sunlight filtered through the lodge's smoke hole as Kira stirred beneath warm blankets. The fire had burned low, its embers casting a gentle glow across familiar faces. Noel sat beside her, his plain coat dusty from yesterday's rescue. His eyes were tired but watchful. Henry entered, bringing fresh wood for the fire. His moccasins made no sound on the packed earth floor. As he stoked the flames, his expression grew serious. "Greaves' men drove more cattle to the spring last night," he said quietly. "They pushed deeper onto our grazing land." Kira's hands trembled as she accepted a cup of herbal tea from Sarah. The matriarch's weathered face showed concern as she listened to her son's report. "How many cattle?" Noel asked, his voice steady. "At least 50 head," Henry replied. "They build more fences too. Armed men watch day and night." Noel stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow. "This cannot stand. I must confront Grieve directly." "No!" Kira grabbed his hand, spilling drops of tea. "He's dangerous. His men carry rifles. The law and right are on our side," Noel said firmly. "We cannot let fear rule us." Sarah spoke in her native tongue, which Henry translated. "My mother says wisdom must guide courage. Many hearts united stand stronger than one man alone." Noel nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll gather those hearts today." As the morning wore on, Kira's strength returned. By midday, she and Noel prepared to leave, though her legs still felt weak. Sarah pressed a small bundle of healing herbs into her hands, speaking softly in Apache. Henry translated, "For strength on the path ahead." The ride home was slow, their horse picking carefully through snow-covered trails. Kira leaned against Noel's back, drawing comfort from his solid presence. The winter sun hung low on the horizon by the time they reached their farmstead. "Rest," Noel told her as he helped her down. "I'll send word to the neighbors." But Kira shook her head. "I need to be there. This started with my father's wrong. I must help make it right." As darkness fell, lanterns bobbed through the snow as Amish families arrived at their door. Men in broad-brimmed hats, women in plain dresses and bonnets. They filed quietly into the main room, their faces curious and concerned. Noel stood before them, Bible in hand. "Friends," he began, "we face a challenge that requires unity and faith." He explained about the spring, about Grieve's unlawful seizure, about the threat to both Amish and Apache ways of life. Murmurs rippled through the gathered families. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in understanding. "Brother Yoda," one man objected, "we are peaceful people. This is not our fight. The scripture calls us to defend the oppressed." Noel countered, opening his Bible. To stand against injustice with love, not violence. Kira stepped forward, her heart pounding. I must speak, she said, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. My father wronged the Apache people. He sold what wasn't his to sell. That shame is part of my story. She took a deep breath. But now I see a chance to make things right. Not through force, but through standing together. Her words hung in the air. Sarah and Henry, who had followed them from the lodge, stood quietly near the door. The Amish families looked between them, generations of mistrust warring with present truth. A knock at the door broke the tension. The preacher entered, stamping snow from his boots. I heard there was a meeting, he said. Some townsfolk sent me. They're tired of Greaves' bullying ways. More voices joined the discussion. The preacher spoke of other farmers who'd lost water rights to Greaves' schemes. Henry described his people's willingness to help watch the spring. The Amish men consulted scripture, seeking guidance in its pages. Slowly, like a spring thaw, resistance melted into resolution. One by one, heads nodded, hands clasped in agreement. Even those who had doubted began to see the rightness of the cause. We'll need everyone, Noel said. Amish farmers to show our peaceful strength, townsfolk to witness and speak truth, Apache friends to help guard the spring with watchful eyes. Sarah spoke through Henry. My people will stand with those who choose justice over greed. The preacher nodded. I'll bring word to others who've suffered under Greaves' hand. Together, we're stronger than his threats. As the meeting drew to a close, lamplight played across the faces in the room, Amish, Apache, and townsfolk united in common cause. Kira looked around in wonder at this unlikely gathering. Where once she had seen only differences, now she saw bridges being built, strength in unexpected alliances. The simple room glowed with more than lantern light. It glowed with hope, with purpose, with the power of people choosing to stand together. Whatever came next, they would face it not alone, but as one community united for justice. Dawn painted the sky in gentle pastels as a remarkable sight unfolded across the snow-dusted valley. Amish farmers in their plain coats walked shoulder to shoulder with Apache hunters, while townsfolk filled the spaces between. Their footsteps crunched in unison through the frosted grass as they approached the contested spring. Greaves' men stood in a rough line, rifles gleaming. Their sneers turned to looks of surprise at the size of the approaching group. The cattle baron himself sat astride his horse, his face darkening at the sight of so many united against him. "What's this foolishness?" Greaves called out, his voice sharp with contempt. "Bringing savages and plain folk to fight your battles?" Noel stepped forward, Kira at his side. His steady voice carried across the morning air. "We come in peace, but with truth that cannot be denied." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather packet, its papers yellow with age but bearing clear official seals. "A courier brought these at first light," Noel announced. Documents filed by Kira's mother years ago, recording the spring rights in her daughter's name. Murmurs rippled through both groups as Noel held the papers high. The county seal was unmistakable, its red wax catching the morning light. Greaves' face twisted. "That fat girl," a false claim from a worthless drunk's daughter. Kira flinched at the words, but stood taller as Noel's hand found hers. The Apache matriarch, Sarah, moved closer, her presence lending strength. The preacher stepped forward to examine the documents. "The seal is genuine," he declared. "These rights were recorded proper and legal before witnesses." Henry translated for his people, while Amish elders nodded in approval. Some of Greaves' men shifted uneasily, looking to their boss for direction. Greaves' eyes darted between the armed Apache hunters and the solid wall of witnesses. His jaw worked as he calculated his odds. Finally, he spat into the dirt. "This ain't finished," he snarled, wheeling his horse around. "There'll be another day to settle accounts." He gestured sharply to his men, who began backing away, their rifles lowered but ready. As the last of Greaves' riders disappeared over the ridge, relief swept through the gathered crowd. Cheers erupted spontaneously. Kira found herself wrapped in Noel's embrace as tears of joy spilled down her cheeks. "Before all these witnesses," Noel declared, his voice ringing with pride, "let it be known that your dignity is restored. Not just by papers and seals, but by the strength of your own heart." The spring burbled peacefully as former strangers clasped hands and embraced. Apache children splashed at the water's edge, while Amish women shared bread with townspeople. Where fence posts had stood as barriers, now people gathered in celebration. Kira looked around in wonder at the scene. Amish, Apache, and townsfolk united in joy around the life-giving water. The divisions that had seemed so permanent just days ago now dissolved like morning frost in the warming sun. The late winter afternoon cast long shadows through Noel's farmhouse windows. Inside, warmth and the rich aroma of baking bread filled every corner. Kira stood at the wooden table, her strong hands working the dough with practiced confidence. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the cook stove, but her eyes sparkled with contentment. 3 children from neighboring farms sat cross-legged by the hearth, listening intently as she told stories while she worked. Their laughter rang pure and sweet through the kitchen. Little Emma, the youngest, clapped her flour-dusted hands as Kira shaped the dough into perfect rounds. "Miss Kira makes the best bread in the valley," Emma declared, earning agreeing nods from her siblings. The door opened, letting in a burst of crisp air as more neighbors arrived. The once suspicious widow Martha bustled in, her arms full of preserves. "Something smells wonderful in here," she said warmly, setting her jars on the counter. The change in her manner toward Kira was as clear as spring water. Noel appeared from the barn, stamping snow from his boots. He crossed to Kira and slipped his arm around her shoulders, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. She leaned into his embrace, leaving flowery fingerprints on his plain black coat. More guests arrived, Henry and his family among them, bearing gifts of dried meat and berries. The Apache matriarch Sarah nodded approvingly at the neat kitchen, at the way Kira had made Noel's house into a true home. Gone were the days of suspicion between their peoples. As twilight deepened outside the frosted windows, the gathering moved to the long table. Bowls of steaming soup and platters of fresh bread passed from hand to hand. Amish caps and Apache blankets mixed together around the wooden boards, an unlikely family bound by something stronger than blood. Before the meal, they bowed their heads together. Noel's prayer rose in both English and Apache, Henry translating softly. The lamplight cast a gentle glow over the scene, catching the tears that welled in Kira's eyes. "I never thought I would know such joy," she whispered to Noel as the others began to eat. "I believed myself worthless, marked by shame. Yet God turned even my weakness into blessing." Noel took her hand under the table, his voice thick with emotion. "You have it backward, dear heart. I was the one rescued, not you. My grief had made me a hollow man until Providence brought you to that town square." Conversation and laughter flowed around them like a healing stream. Children darted between chairs, playing with wooden toys Henry had carved. The widow Martha praised Kira's soup recipe, while Sarah shared stories of springs long past. The warmth of belonging filled every corner of the room, as tangible as the lamplight glowing against the windows. Kira looked around the table at these faces, Amish, Apache, and townsfolk, now dear as family. In their eyes she saw not judgment but love, not mockery but respect. Her heart swelled with gratitude for this gift she had never dared to dream of. Not just a husband, but a true home. a community, and a future bright with promise. The laughter of children rang out again, sweet and clear in the lamplit room, as outside the first stars began to shine through breaking clouds. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.